Hey, welcome back to the Stick Figure Historian American series, guys. In our last episode, the Massachusetts Bay Colony leaders had just banned the Salemites from appointing Roger Williams to be their pastor. And, well, they could prevent Roger from being called a pastor, but they couldn't keep him quiet. He simply went undercover. Not exactly like super spy kind of undercover. A lot less sneaky than that. But just as cool, really. He shared his beliefs, opinions, and disagreements openly with the people of Salem by both speaking and writing. For a few months he kept up this undercover ministry, but then he decided to move on again. South this time, to Plymouth. Plymouth was a little colony inhabited by another group of English religious dissenters. These men were of a more separatist leaning, and had spent a period of exile in the Netherlands previous to founding their own little colony here in America. This settlement had an entirely different and longer history than the upstart Massachusetts Bay Colony, and was therefore entirely separate from them. It's pretty interesting, actually. I'll have to do a series on its history sometime. But anyways, perhaps it was the fact that Plymouth was completely separate from the Massachusetts Bay Colony that drew Roger to seek a place among them. And it would seem he did find a place. The people in Plymouth were very friendly, and the church there readily welcomed his help. Roger wasn't given an official position, but he often shared the pulpit with the kind pastor, and the colonists flocked to hear him preach God's word to them. It was during his time here in Plymouth that Roger began to take interest in the curious native peoples that often came to trade with the colonists. He was filled with compassion for these Indians, as they were called, and he yearned to share the gospel with them. And here the gift God had given to him of learning languages proved a great blessing. Roger conversed eagerly with the Indians and listened carefully to them, and in no time at all could speak their tongue rather fluently, and could tell them the story of Jesus' great love, just the same as he did to his own countrymen. But as Roger came to know the Indians better, he began to be troubled. These people, their fathers, and their fathers' fathers, had lived on this land for centuries. This vast expanse of forests, fields, and coastline was their hunting grounds, their gardens, their home. Roger began to realize that his own people, the Englishmen, were taking this land away from the Indians without even asking them or paying for it. He knew this was stealing. Just because the English king had given them a piece of paper called a charter didn't give them rights to steal this land. And even worse, Roger knew this would give the gospel a bad name. For how could these Indians think that Christians were people of a righteous and loving God if they were stealing from others? Roger began to voice his concerns to his fellow colonists in Plymouth and suggest that something should be done to right this wrong against the native people. But sadly, his words met with ill reception. Too prevalent was the idea in those days that God had given the Europeans a right to the land in America simply because they were Christians. The Old Testament, particularly the book of Joshua, was often quoted and used to prove that as God's people, it was their duty to drive out the heathen tribes. This land controversy was not the only point of contention that Roger began to have with the Plymouth congregation, though. More and more he began to see that these people too had not truly separated themselves from the Anglican Church. They still kept many of the customs and repeated some of the false teachings. But when he tried to talk to them about it, his ideas were rejected. After 2 relatively tranquil years of living amongst these professed separatists, Roger decided to migrate back north. He and Mary packed their few belongings, bundled up their newly born daughter, whom they had named Mary after her sweet mother, and started down the dirt trail leading out of Plymouth. William Brewster, the governor, gave the little family a warm farewell and good wishes for their journey. But it was with some secret relief that he watched them ride away into the forest. Roger's strange opinions, as Brewster termed them, had been getting a bit irksome. It was 1633 when the wandering preacher, his dauntless wife, and their little child arrived in Salem once more. His old acquaintances were pleased to see him again, and before long he was secretly adopted as a sort of assistant pastor. This was largely the doing of the official pastor, Samuel Skelton. This Skelton was a bold fellow, quite used to conflicts with the government of the colony, and by no means afraid of their power. As with anything he put his hand to, Roger served well and faithfully in this undercover work, all the while managing to also continue his ministry among the Indians.